Yay, we're here. Hello, and welcome to Writing Characters with Agency. Yes, my name is Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between, and I will be your host tonight, talking to four fabulous panelists on Balticon's evening of Sunday, May 30th show. So before we get started, telling you exactly how to create characters with agency and how you can go wrong, I'm going to let everybody to introduce themselves, starting off with Brenda Clough.
I learned this year that I am the first female Asian science fiction writer in this country. Wow. Somebody went and dug through and discovered I was the first one. So that's a very exciting thing. I've been writing since for a long, long time. And I've been attending Balticon for a number of years now. And I have right now, this year, the current year's stunt is I am publishing one novel a month starting in January. And these are all up at Bookview Cafe, one a month. Yes, 11 novels. And don't think that I wrote them this year. No. They've been around for a while. But the first one, like all good drugs, is free. And I'm going to post the link. I'm going to post at least Bookview Cafe's link in the comment in the chat so you can look at it. But they're Victorian thrillers of melodramatic nature, and so I can guarantee to scratch that itch if you happen to have it.
Yep. Okay, great. Kaya.
Hi, I'm Micaiah Johnson, or Kaya, which is easier because my name has every vowel in the world in it. I am a science fiction writer, though I dabble in kind of all genres. I'm bad at sticking within genre lines. I wrote The Space Between Worlds, which came out last year. And I spend most of my time here in Nashville feeding the Cardinals and trying not to utterly lose my mind in quarantine, which thankfully is almost at an end for me. So I will survive.
That's good. And congratulations on winning the Compton Crook for your first novel.
Yay!
We are all looking to help you celebrate next year, but meanwhile, we're just so happy you could be with us today. Whether it be from the West Coast or from Nashville, because I know you've been traveling. Yes. So anyway, Karen.
Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Osborne. I'm the author of Architects of Memory and Engines of Oblivion, both from Tor Books. And I also have short stories out at places like Uncanny and Beneath Ceaseless Skies and Fireside. I write primarily science fiction right now. I'm really interested in claustrophobic space stories. I wonder why. Pandemic, quarantine, maybe. So I'm writing a lot of that. And I love talking about agency and giving my characters agency of all kinds. And I'm just looking forward to the panel.
Do you know what they expect? Speaking of claustrophobic, I have to throw this in. Do you know how they are plan to select for long-term space missions? They plan to use the submarine model. And
I told them that. Go ahead.
Okay, and the submarine model basically does favor introverts.
I told them they had to have a member of SIFWA in the space colony thing, so we have an in. Because how can you go to Mars without having a member of SIFWA?
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ryan? And please give us your intro.
Sure. My name is Ryan Van Loan. I'm an epic fantasy writer. I have a trilogy out with Tor Books. My debut last year was called The Sin and the Steel. It's about an autodidactic street rat. She's kind of part Sherlock Holmes, part young Indiana Jones, all herself. And it's about her and her swordsmen who are partners in crime solving. They're the first private investigators in a world controlled by trading companies and empires and gods caught in an endless war. And the duo are determined to upend their corrupt society, one case at a time. The sequel, The Justice and Revenge, comes out July 13th. And I am definitely an introvert, although I don't know if I would want to be on a one-way space trip right now for the foreseeable future.
Not with space corporations. You don't. Nope.
No.
Never ends well.
No, 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 no. They're
No, don't-
cheerfully saying, we're going to lose a few here. Yeah, I was talking to a rocket scientist earlier this week, and it's like, we need to think more like Musk. I mean, he says right out front, we're going to lose a few. And I'm going, oh no, people do
Okay.
not want to hear that.
Don't go with Musk.
No.
No.
Anyway, okay, back to the panel. I will shut up now, just ask questions. The thought, you know, we all want our characters, especially we all want the characters we identify with, to have agency, to have the power to make their own choices and make those choices feel natural within the context of the books. Where, you know, how do you, in your own writing, ensure that your characters have that kind of agency, that they are not prey to the plot or prey to just reacting to other people's actions? We'll start with you, Ryan.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, it probably varies depending on what type of writer you are. So I'm a writer who I can't write a book until I have the character in mind. And the way that happens is the character will just appear typically by talking to me, which is something you can't get away with if you're not a writer. But a voice will just start talking to me when I'm on a walk or I'm in the shower, I'm on a hike, somewhere quiet. And you know, their voice, the sentences that they're speaking will just give me a sense of who they are. That will help me place them in what type of fantasy setting that would, you know, they're from. And I just start to learn more and more from them. And, you know, that process takes a few weeks, but I'm also, so that sounds very pantsing, but I'm also a huge plotter, an outliner. So I use 7-point plot structure, which makes you start at the end and kind of jump around from the beginning and through the middle. And, because I have that character voice solidly in my head, I think that helps a lot with the plotting to make sure that the character choices are showing up in those big plot points. Now, that said, you know, I do think that there's ways to do this right and to do it wrong. I think one of the best ways is just early on, make sure that the reader understands you know, who that character is, what their strengths and flaws are. And, you know, often the strengths can also be flaws if taken too far, and really what they want and what lines they're willing to cross, or what lines are, you know, out of bounds and that they're not going to cross. And then I think early on, once we've established that, you know, showing them face some resistance, maybe the inciting incident, and then the way they overcome that, push through that, which could maybe be your first kind of pinch point in the beginning of Act 1 there, are good ways to show that, hey, we know who this person is, we know what they want, they've just encountered resistance, they've had the agency to overcome that, might have got them in more trouble, and now we're, you know, coming into the next act, and that gives you a solid base to build upon. So I think early on, those are some good ways that at least I try to go about it. And, you know, I think I do have that kind of quasi, you know, I'm pantsing the character to some degree, but I'm really outlining the plot itself.
Okay. Brenda?
You know, I am a really far over on the pants side of the spectrum. I don't think I've ever planned a book. I don't do plot outlines, combat tables, character lists, nothing. You understand, there is nothing. I just pick up a pen and I begin. And it is, but there's a whole bunch of rules that you sort of know about stories and how they should be. And the minute you start just, you know, completely nude, writing the first sentence with a pen on a piece of paper, the rules of story constrain you, and your characters have to have some kind of control over their lives. When you think about it, that is, for instance, why a lot of books about children are about orphans, or about kids whose parents, you know, they're all, you know, fighting the Crimea War this year or something like that. So they're not around and the kids have agency. That is such a deep rule that you just have to do that. It's, in a sense, I'm not sure why it's a problem unless you get into unless you fall into one of those vortexes, because it's sort of the root of fiction. Your characters have to be able to fight back.
Yes, absolutely, they do. Or they just get acted upon. We don't want that to happen. Karen, what about you? How do you ensure that your characters have agency?
I am I used to be a complete pantser, but I turned to plotting once I started to publish because of deadlines. And I'm never going back. So I've seen both sides of the spectrum, and in both times it's always making sure that everything my character does comes from a choice or a decision that that character makes. I'm really interested in one of my own little things, writer things that I'm interested in is agency within organizations and places where you don't normally get agency. I grew up Catholic. I grew up around a whole bunch of Catholic women who were running parishes and doing all sorts of things. But as we know, it's not a very, female forward organization. So
It's not
what I
female friendly
witnessed
at
growing
all,
up,
yes.
yeah, what I witnessed growing up was the women finding ways to express their agency, not up like in a normal corporation or a normal structure, but out into the communities and into various different things that they did. And one of the things I noticed is that they were making decisions, they were making choices, they were making that sort of thing. So even if something, I think, even if your the plot presents something, your character doesn't react, she decides. She has options. Make sure the character always has options, even if those options are just terrible. Well, especially if those options are terrible.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the Catholic Church because, talk about an erased history of, throughout, if those of us who were raised Catholic know this, you guys may not, the rest of the world may not, but the entirety of the parish is actually run by the women taking care of the parish priest, and they are not nuns. They are not part of the organization. And their decisions largely decide what is happening in that church and then informs what happens in other churches. And their role completely lost to history.
100%.
Yep. So anyway, Micaiah, you're newer to this than these old hands and the rest of the panel here. How did you ensure that your characters had agency in the space between worlds? Because let me tell you, they wouldn't have succeeded and resonated with so many people if they didn't.
Yes, for me, it's just, you're making sure that the characters are making the decision. And the two ways that I'm going to say we usually, but really I'm going to say like I have previously failed at that is you either you let the world make the decisions for them, right? It's like, oh, now there's a solar flare, so this is what's going to happen. Whereas it's just like I feel like events of the world and elements of outside pressures should affect and pressure decisions, but it shouldn't limit, and like it shouldn't assign them, right? It's like it shouldn't leave them one way out. And the other is making sure that you're making decisions as your character and not as the writer. I think there's so many times that we're just like, oh my God, I would love to see these two people in the room together. Or I would love to see this person do this, even if it's not authentic to the character. It's just we're thinking with like big picture cinematic author brain, like I guess God vision. We're just like, we just want to move this around. But if it isn't authentic to the character, no matter how like cool we think that scene is, it just ends up, not being agented. We're just moving chess pieces rather than following an authentic, like, person that we have made. So for me, that was like a big issue because of course, and then I had the big thing that I noticed made characters feel more real to me upon rereadings is if your character has decisions, like have them review them and have them make bad decisions and then go back and say, well, I'm not going to do that, kind of that very human thing where decisions feel real, the more impact they have and the more consideration they're given. And so if you have that where it's like, well, let's look at this, let's do this, then you don't have a story which happens where everything is in response and you have those plots that are just and then, but instead you want to get to the point where they're reviewing and they're, making decisions. You get those plots that are like, and so. So it feels causal and not just chaotic and spectacular, but it makes sense.
If A, then B.
Yes.
If B, then C. Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Are there any times, do all the characters in a book need agency? Or are there characters who can be acted upon or should be acted upon for the purposes of the plot? Or does everybody need it? I don't think I'm not offering any value judgments. I'm asking that question because, frankly, giving agency to a certain extent implies giving a backstory and creating a character, even if they're just a spear carrier. Karen, what's your thoughts on that?
I think so. I think so, just because it's more fun and interesting that way. I know a lot of, I hate to go in my books, but in my books.
Well, I'm all doing in my books here. Let's do that.
Yeah, well, in my books, there's at least two characters that, because they had agency when I was writing them, they kind of made decisions on their own, which opened up a whole different sort of plot like structure and options, because they had the ability to, I mean, because they were making choices, and I was throwing them into situations, and I'm going, okay, what would Len do? What would Natalie do? It was just a lot more interesting as a writer, and I think it's a lot more interesting for readers to just see and feel everyone having that agency in their lives in the book. So I'm gonna say, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Micaiah,
Yeah, for sure. I would say, like, on the spectrum, you have agency and authenticity. And so you don't want, I think a lot of times people confuse agency just with action, right? Where it's like, this person's going to punch people all the time, and that means agency. Whereas it's like, I think there are characters whose agency would be expressed much more subtly. And like, there are characters who are, if you want to drive home that they're raised a certain way, that they're very passive, all of those things, then you don't want to sacrifice authenticity for the sake of having people just do things. So for me, like, that's kind of the balance that you want to strike. Agency that is authentic to that person, as opposed to this vision that we have of what agency looks like, which is like, rappelling down a mountain or something. But as opposed to that, that idea where it's like, as long as they're strong, they're blowing something up. But there are so many different ways that agency manifests, where sometimes it is like a quieter agency and how they express it, but it's authentic to what they would do and what they would want. But I don't think you ever want a character that's absent agency. I think that we've certainly, like, science fiction, I went through a thing where I was reading all the golden age science fiction. So you see where it's like agented character and they're like cardboard friends. And I think that it becomes fairly clear when a certain character isn't thought through, or a certain character should have maybe been combined with another character. So for me, I think every character should be agented. I don't think every character needs to mark that agency with bombastic action.
Okay, well, that's interesting, because we have a question or a note in the questions from one of our attendees, that even if a supporting character is constrained by their role in the story, a soldier, say, can't you ascribe agency to them via small things, facial expressions, hand gestures, etc., which seems to speak exactly to what you were talking about. So, Ryan, what about you? Does every character need agency in your story?
I would say there. I agree with Micaiah. There's a spectrum. I do think it goes all the way down to no. So if somebody appears on the page simply to attack our protagonist and is immediately dealt with, I guess they have agency in that they moved onto the page, but we don't know why or how they did it, and so they're quickly gone. But to the extent that someone's taking up room in that scene, I really am a believer in everything in the scene holding multiple swords, if you will. And so in this case, like, if you're going to have somebody on the page for a while, I do think we need to see some agency from them. That said, this does get into that kind of like his agency activity or reactivity sort of question. But I do think that it's interesting and can change things up to have some characters who explicitly don't have agency. And I think there's been entire books written about stuff like that. But so I do think that, like, that's a choice. You just have to be careful and conscious when you're making those decisions. If you're going to have a character on the page for any length of time, and they're only going to be reacting, and they're not going to be making their own decisions, and they really are truly without agency, that can be tricky to handle. So I think you just need to go into it with eyes wide open.
Brenda?
It's when you're writing a book, it's like doing a movie. And when you're doing a movie, and not everybody has screen time, if you put the camera on a character for a long period of time, you're indicating that it's important. If If Steven Spielberg shoots a lot of footage about ET, maybe the movie's about ET. If so you have to, when you're writing your book, you're controlling how much screen time each character gets. Not all of them are going to have a lot of screen time. There's extras in the back. There's the guys with the red shirts. Not everybody is going to have a speaking role. And they can't do that if you want the drama to be focused, if you want the plot to go in the direction you want it to go. And particularly in those casts of thousands books, there's just going to be like a lot of orcs in the background, a lot of Rohirrim in the background that are just never going to have any agency. You can't do it if the book's already over 2,000 pages long.
Yeah, I find that more in short stories that I write than long work, but yeah. You do have to make choices as to who gets on the screen time. Do you have you ever had a character? I mean, some of you haven't been in your series very long, but some of you have. Have you ever had a character slip through your fingers that you thought that you'd given them agency, but you suddenly realized that the agency they had in book one is not necessarily there in other stories or other books?
One of the things that I'm doing with writing these a series of 11 books about one person is that she is aging. One of the big problems with the genre, I think, is that there's a lot of books that are written about teenagers or very young persons. There aren't that many books about older women, you know. So all right, I fixed it. But as my heroine gets older, agency starts to shift. She can maybe no longer just punch people out. You have to work it in other ways. And so as the series goes on, there's large chunks of the books where she doesn't appear. I wrote a whole novel where essentially everyone said, but right now she's in Southeast Asia. What are we going to do here? Because there was too much plot to squeeze it into one book, so we just split it in two. It was you can have agency, but it's not necessarily what the others were saying. It's not necessarily pulling out the gun and blowing people away. There's other ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yes.
not just in terms of aging characters, but in terms of characters who happen to not appear to have a lot of agency. The classic a few 20 years ago was, in order for a woman to have agency, she had to be a BKC or butt kicking chick. And frankly, that is historically not how women exercise their agency. It's still not how Nancy Pelosi exercises her agency, yet nobody would call her anything but a badass. So, yeah, there is that. But what about, the thing I was thinking of here has more to do things like, there was a lot of criticism in the wake of the last revivals of the X-Files that Dana Scully had lost all agency. She had stopped being a character who drove the action and basically was a character who reacted to or was reacted upon. Have you ever felt that happening in your own works? Kaya, I see you nodding really hard here.
I have no poker face. Zoom is the death of me. Yes, no, this was just such an experience that I had. And this ties into what you were saying earlier about the kind of stereotypical agented female as somebody in leather with guns. I have this issue in my book, it's Esther, where I think that there's this presupposition where it's like, this is a female character who is classed as domestic, who's very religious. And so a lot of the markers of that translate as a non-agented person, right? Because she's not, getting into fights, she's not doing this stuff. And so what I ended up having to do as I went through drafts and realizing that I'd done this is surface that kind of agency, surface this as a deliberate decision, surface this as her strength. And I think the best example for how subtly agency can be implied, even for just 2-second long characters, I'm going to leave the realm of the literary because you started it, you went to X-Files, so I'm going to go to Justice League. I made the very questionable decision to watch Joss Whedon's Justice League alongside Zack Snyder's Justice League. It took many hours. It was, please, I'm a saint. But the one big thing that stuck out to me was how clumsy Whedon's use of agency was versus Snyder's. And so particularly what I'm looking at, and like everything else we can debate, but just this, where you deal with, like, they both featured homeless people, right? In Joss Whedon's, there's a homeless man on the curb with a sign that said, "I tried," which is just fine.
Wimpy.
Whereas in Zack Snyder's, when someone is trying to, they're trying to break into Cyborg's apartment, homeless people are on the corner and they say, "Hey, what are you doing?" And both 2-second shots, both like very little time. And yet there's such a difference in how agency works. One is a member of a community that takes pride in this community, is like interrogating somebody who's doing something they think is wrong. And the other is like, Sarah McLachlan playing in the background, sad shot of somebody with their head down and I tried thing. So those two shots are equally both characters that aren't going to reappear, both characters in 2 seconds, but how differently the power is oriented there, right? And so just kind of things like that, like applying those much more subtle displays of power to Esther, where there are moments where she's just like, nah, where she just, has that iron spine, even though she doesn't need to like, cuss anybody out or punch anybody, just surfacing that this is a manifestation of her agency because this is her choice to be in this position.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, those are all really good responses.
Now as he vamps until he comes up with an answer. I've done that one.
Well, I had it in my head, and then as soon as you called on me, it went right out. What was the question again?
Okay, have you ever had a character
That's right. Okay.
that slipped through your hands,
Yeah.
like Dana Scully obviously slipped through the showrunner's hands in the later X-Files?
Now I got it. Thank you. Oh man, at least it all came back to me, so I'm not like starting from square one again. So I've written well, I'm working on my 12th novel now. I haven't had that happen in a long time, but early on when I started off as a pantser and then slowly began writing more outlines and more outlines that became more detailed until I have, a pretty complex process today. Those early ones, I definitely had that issue, and I would get that feedback, and like I think my first novel, I probably didn't even fix it well, but the second novel on, I started to address that, and then I think by the third novel, I wasn't having that issue. But when I was, what I realized is that I either hadn't clarified or made it clear to myself or on the page what that character wanted, and why they wanted it and what they were willing to do for that. And so their actions, weren't tied back to something concrete. So you never knew, like, were they doing this just because the plot demanded it? Were they doing it because, Ryan didn't know where he's going with that scene, and so they just went off in this direction, or what? Another thing that I noticed too is that, sometimes I wasn't doing a good enough job of having them react to their own actions. So I think that's a really good way to show agency. And I know this was brought up earlier in the panel, is to have them reflect on their choices, to have those choices have ramifications, and then have other characters maybe call them out on that. And it's a really good way to have some tight scenes there, relationships between characters, to be like, why did you just do that? Well, I did it because of this. And then like you have this interesting conversation, as opposed to, the author telling you over the course of 4 pages, they did this because this and this, and this is why. So I think there's a lot of techniques and things there. And I think agency is something that the more you write, the easier it becomes a natural part of how you're creating characters. At least that was true for me. But early on, I think it is something you want to be conscious of.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of using the questioning to address the ramifications and impact of an action, because boy, does that replace a lot of data dump.
Sure.
I like that. I really do. Karen, what about you? Have you ever had a character slip through your fingers and do a Dana Scully?
Well, I had to fight it. I had to fight it real hard because Architects of Memory, that main character, Ash, is indentured, so she has no power over her own personal self or future right now. And she also has a terminal illness with no access to healthcare. So it would be very easy to let the world act on her. So I kept on, like, I put a Post-it note on my computer with what Ryan said. Ash wants to be with her lady. Ash wants to survive. So whenever we come to a point where the world is acting, and the world acts a lot in this book, and there's a lot of acting going on. You know, you always go back to what does she want and how far is she going to go to get it? And as long as it's pretty far, as long as your character, it doesn't matter if your character is like doing speeches or kicking butts or cleaning houses or whatever, as long as they're willing to go pretty far to get what they want, you're going to have ability to insert agency in there. And as the series goes on, she does get sicker and sicker, spoiler, to a point. I'm not going to spoil the last bit, but so you just have to keep on yourself to be a responsible author and keep that post-it note right there.
Yeah, keep the old goals, motivation, and conflict right front and center.
Mm-hmm.
This actually feeds into a character who starts out apparently without agency, feeds into a question we received in the Q&A, and they reference it in terms of coming of age stories, but I think it applies to any character. It could apply to any character that is in their story is the growth from lack of agency to agency. But the question reads, in coming of age stories, they often start with a reactive low agency and character and grow into their power, becoming more proactive high agency. Would it make sense to, in a sequel, put them in a new situation that takes away their sense of control and then have them grow with agency? Or would that be seen as retconning the character's agency?
That gets you into those irritating novels, or a good example would be Frozen versus Frozen 2. You remember that in the original movie, you know, Let It Go, the Queen Elsa manages to handle her powers and figure out what the hell is going on. And so at the end of Frozen, she's totally in control of it, right? You remember that. But then in Frozen 2, they dial it back again. Oh, we lost our agency again, lost it somewhere, and we have got to wrestle with it, the whole thing again. You can do this if you're Disney and if they sing songs. I don't know if the rest of us can do this.
Ryan, thoughts?
Yeah, I think what it is really about is just giving them, I'm not sure if it's taking away their sense of control. I think it's just giving them new challenges, new ways to grow. So Brenda talked about that character who's growing older, and just due to probably her position in society and everything, you know, she's starting to have different ways of showcasing her agency. And so that's going to feel and react differently, and characters are going to react differently to that, you know, to somebody who's, you know, pulling the spider web in the background versus somebody's punching you in the face. And so I would say, look at it that way. What are the new scenarios they're going to be in, that the agency that they had before, they're going to carry through with them, but they're going to use it in different ways, right? It's kind of the whole leveling up thing with superheroes. They start off small and, you know, they can only take on a few things, and then suddenly they're Superman. Well, Superman still has agency. He just has different agency than Clark Kent might. And so I think it's about thinking about it that way. I do agree with Brenda. There are some novels, a few series that we probably all think of, that like the end of the book always is with them like either losing their agency or suddenly they're back to square one. And then the next novel is them doing it all over again and rinse and repeat. That does get pretty old pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes. To take again an off-topic reference, does anybody read Janet Ivanovich's Stephanie Plums? I stopped after volume 12 because she always winds up back in the same place. They're hysterical, they're wonderful, but she's got to make a choice between Ranger and yeah. Anyway,
I began reading the Sharp novels about Richard Sharp and the fighting in Spain and during the Napoleonic Wars. You remember those? There's a TV series with them starring Sean Bean, but I just had the books, and I noticed that, you know, although he goes through horrific things in every book, but then he never actually gets anywhere with this. Even if he like wins the love of his girlfriend, or he wins at the battle of whatever it is, the next one is still to do. We never actually get off the treadmill, and so he never gradually, I think over the series, I forget how many volumes there are, he gradually rises in the ranks a little bit, but he never actually gets to what the romance writers would call HEA, the happily ever after.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. You either expect somebody to get to a happily ever after or to get killed with the glorious ending, so that you justify this thing. But that's me. I'm sorry. I should be receding. But Karen, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think about these stories where a character develops agency only to lose it again and start from ground zero?
They drive me bonkers. Personally, I have done that many times in my life. I have a tendency of going, I'm gonna do a thing, and then doing the thing, and then anyway. So personally, I find them bonkers because they reflect on my past. But I am also a real fan of Star Trek. And stuff like it. And one of the reasons why I was always like, why do I like Star Trek better than all the other stars? Like, I mean, why? And it's competence porn. It's competent, happy, interesting. I mean, not always happy, but competent, interesting
Well
people.
adjusted.
Yeah, maybe well adjusted. Well, maybe it depends on the character, but
right. But more well adjusted than a lot of them.
And that's not something you see a lot. These people know what they are doing. They are professionals and they want to help. And it's refreshing sometimes to see someone who really knows what they're doing, just like get in there. It's like Katie Porter with a whiteboard. You love it. It feels beautiful. Like Katie Porter with a whiteboard is the definition of agency. And it's not like she's, I mean, she doesn't.
She's not in leather. She doesn't have a sword. She
But
has a marker, and it is mighty.
Yeah, but it's that particular sense of so that's what I think.
Cool. Micaiah, I'm sorry.
I am stealing so many phrases just from these prior answers. I'm stealing Brenda's "we never get off the treadmill." I'm stealing Karen's "competence porn." But for the majority of my answer, I'll be stealing from Ryan. No, I just love that idea that if we keep resetting, it's not as interesting as seeing them in new challenges. And what I find, just to add on to that, what I find the most interesting is when they develop a set of skills and reactions that serve them in their prior challenge, then they're detrimental in their current, right? Where it's just like, oh, I can't just do the same thing I did. And so it's learning how to like kind of diversify your approaches and learning that, not everything will be the same enemy, and you'll have to like look at these things different ways. You can't just slay dragon, lose your sword, find your sword, slay another dragon, lose your sword, find your sword, slay another dragon. Instead, it's just like, oh, now I'm at a ball and the dragon I have to slay is making people like me or something. Just these different ways in which these other challenges can approach. Because I think especially in coming of age stories, if we're dealing with like, if we want to communicate like how should the world be? Like, do we really want to communicate that there's no way to grow into power? There's only ways to lose power. I'm much more interested in the story that maybe does trace that journey to agency, whether it's from somebody young or somebody who just wasn't agented, but then also teaches how to grow into comfort in that agency and the challenges that come with that. That just seems like it's so much more rewarding, so much more refreshing, and so much more real. Like you don't forget how to drive every 5 years. You learn how to drive something else. Like that's how human beings are. We have resets, but we've learned from them and we have like this strong residue and we build upon it. So this idea that's just like, oh, you got magical powers, and at the end of every season or book, you're going to be powerless and have to find your powers again just because we don't know what to do with you, is so much less interesting than the really difficult work of how do you exist in the world with this power without hurting others, which is the real question that we like struggle with.
Yeah, and we do want to see ourselves as succeeding, as competent. All of these things, which makes one of the questions we have here rather interesting. To flip it on its head, are there any characters that we really relate to that do not have agency? Any really popular characters? And you mentioned Ilsa with Frozen, who frequently loses her agency. And the other one I think of is, but this is universally reviled, is Bella from the Twilight Saga. She's constantly being acted upon by, oh dear, I'm just perfect. and I have to choose vampire or
Werewolf.
werewolf. Oh my. But those are the only two characters that I can think of that.
I can think of one.
Okay.
In Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, Fanny Price is famously passive.
Mhm.
She's essentially, because she's an poor and she's living with her rich relations, they all beat on her and they make her, you know, essentially a second level person. And she just accepts this. She does not really fight back at all, except at one crucial moment in the plot. And then that's it. And it doesn't actually go anywhere. And people complain about this bitterly, but that's the classic example of the person who allegedly has no agency. And of course, partly that tied into cultural things. Women were not supposed to have agency, but in one moment she does.
And that's the moment everybody remembers her for.
Yeah, and it was, you know, it was the sort of thing. Yeah, and what's interesting why Jane Austen wrote her that way, it was because so many people complain, you know, that Lizzie Bennet, she's really not a nice girl. She was so mouthy, you know, she was so pushy. She, you know, really didn't deserve that Darcy. And so she got enough feedback from readers that she said, all right, I'm going to fix this for you, honey. And she wrote someone like a limp sock. And it's still a classic, but it's a different book. And we don't like it so well. You know, think of how many movie versions there are of Pride and Prejudice versus Mansfield Park.
Okay. Micaiah?
Yes, no, I just had this very surreal moment where I was thinking of Vimes and it showed up in chat and I was thinking Fanny Price and you said it. I once made a very compelling argument that Fanny Price was an automaton.
No, oh, good. I like it.
She is programmed throughout that book where it's like she took that in, she learned her lesson. I think that there are a lot of characters that don't have traditional agency. I think it's more obvious when they're female characters. I got in this really amazing discussion with, I will actively say my better, an actual children's literature scholar, whose comment was that you can easily see the lack of agency in Bella, but nobody talks about Catcher in the Rye and how this is like kind of this like lost boy being driven around and his desire for his sister. He paints these desires on his sister and like is kind of driven by these like imaginaries, and his favorite places are revisiting places where he wasn't agented. But you know, there's all these different ways in which, like, if it's a girl who's kind of like emotional and maybe whatever Bella is, there's so many adjectives that come to mind. It's so easy to say like that's a lack of agency. Whereas when we see the kind of like very alcoholic dude character who's really driven by vices and doesn't really make his own decisions, that's not marked in, I think, cultural minds as a lack of agency, even though it very much is. So yeah, absolutely. I think Fanny Price is exactly the paradigm because that's the view of like female domestic lack of agency. But I feel like a lot of dudes get passes when really they are equally acted upon. And
well,
but we still love them. Like I love Sam Bonds very much. And I don't think that he's utterly without agency. That would definitely be other characters in that series.
And you think about it's particularly useful to refer to Jane Austen because we all know the plot, but a lot of characters, male characters, do not have agency in that milieu, the cultural milieu. You know, essentially, if you didn't have money, you were shit out of luck, and so it was hard. You know, and people who had money could make people who didn't have money do stuff. But what I was actually going to go around to was a lot of the discussion is about women because that's the ones that we're really noticing. We are more aware now that it's important to write women, older women, ugly women, fat women into a more powerful position because for so long they have been written essentially as, you know, persons of no agency at all.
Yeah. Okay, I am going to basically ask Ryan and Karen the next couple questions because we are coming up on the end of our time. This has flown past. You guys have been a great panel. But I haven't gotten to all the questions yet on the screen. And the first one that we have is, have you ever, I guess everybody can give me a yes or no on this one. Have you ever finished a work where you thought that the characters all had agency, but when you got it to your beta readers, they said, no? Did you ever find yourselves in that position? We can do that one quick.
I sorry.
Go right ahead, Karen.
I still hear from readers sometimes. It depends a lot on your own perspective in your own life and how you've lived your own life and how the world has worked on you as a person. Because I certainly think I did a lot of agency giving in my book, but sometimes I hear from people who say, oh my God, Ash didn't do, and so yes, but I think you're always going to get those responses. I think if you don't get those responses from at least one beta reader, that you need to kind of examine what you're doing. I'm really big on hearing, okay, I've gotten all the responses from all the beta readers and they all say something different. I'm doing good here. But that's just me.
Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, I think I addressed that earlier. I haven't really, I haven't from an editor. My first couple of books, close friends that read those, I got that feedback. But, and I think I talked about a couple of examples of how I tried to fix that.
Yeah, okay. Micaiah?
Yes, and this is my plug for getting sensitivity readers, where I was like, this is good, I'm doing good for the prior work, not A Space Between Worlds. And then I got feedback from someone's like, well, you realize that this is a very like typical depiction of this person being in this way. And it's just like, oh, no, I didn't, but that's why you're here. Thank you. So get sensitivity readers, pay them and listen to them. That's my whole plug.
That's a good one. Brenda?
Because at this moment I'm writing a novel set in like 1890. People are not going to have agency. Women did not have the vote. There was, I think that at that moment you could divorce your husband, but you probably could not take the kids with you. There was there were enough issues that if you're writing in a historical period, you just have to stick with what you got there. They have agency, but it's not going to be the standard kind of agency involving sticking people with knives. I'm writing a novel now about a guy who is essentially severely wounded and sick. And the entire arc of the book, which takes 10 years of time, is him getting better. And he takes charge of that, but there's only so much you can do with that. Healing is, the closing of wounds and the healing of stuff is not something you really can sort of like do. It has to happen, but you're not really able to say, well, cancer, let's go. It has to just happen. And sometimes it doesn't happen. So,
Okay.
it'll be an interesting book.
Okay, I am sorry, we are down to like 3 minutes and we do have one question that has not been answered. And this is a free for all, one person raise their hand and do it. And then we've got to, unfortunately, do our closing where everybody tells you where to find them on the web and their latest title. So the question is, how do you give a character agency whose actions will not be seen by your point of view character?
I'll take this one. I think Robert Jordan did a really great job of this, and Kate Elliott does a good job of this as well. By having other characters talk about actions that are going on that are influencing the world around, that are going to have impact on what the main POV characters are doing. And then what's really nice is typically over time starting to attribute those actions to a single person or an organization or others. And so through that, you start to see that these other people that we don't know have agency and are influencing our plot. And that actually just gives a lot of added depth to the world as well. So, I mean, that's one way that I've seen it.
Okay, great. All righty then. I'm going to ask you all to tell folks where they can find you and what your latest release is. And if you want to write your website or social media in the chat, folks can save that after this program. So, Micaiah?
Yes, I wrote The Space Between Worlds. That is the most recent book I've written and the only book I've written. Though if you're going to purchase it, please wait 3 days. The paper book is coming out and hardcovers are too expensive. So wait until that comes out for sure. You can usually find me online on Twitter, too much, arguing about very silly things at Micaiah_Johnson. So if you can spell my name, you can get there. It's just at Micaiah_Johnson at Twitter. And that's the only real social media that I follow. I have like a token Instagram that I was like kind of forced to get publicity wise, but I'm very bad at it.
I feel your pain. I am too. Brenda?
Well, I am at Bookview Cafe. Oh, and I've just posted the link. I'm so clever. I've posted the link to the chat so you can find the free novel if you'd like it. I am also on Facebook, and I have a webpage, brendaclough.net. So you can Google on my name. I'm the first 300 hits that come up. I'm really everywhere, like white on rice.
Cool. All righty then. Karen?
Karen Osborne, KarenOsborne.com. I'm at Karenthology on Twitter and Insta. I spend way too much time there. Come say hi. And once again, Architects of Memory and Engines of Oblivion. If you like anti-corporate space stories with lots of blood. So,
Okay.
and I will see you all around this wonderful world of ours.
Okay, great. Ryan?
Yeah, so ryanvanloan.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at ryanvanloan. Like I said, my novel, the first in the series, came out last year, called The Sin and the Steel. The hardcover is actually discounted less than the paperback right now. I think right before the paperback drops. So if you want a deal, I would snag that. And then the sequel, The Justice and Revenge, drops in July, and the final book is written and ready to go. So you won't be waiting.
Great. Great.
Yay.
Okay, one question that if anybody wants to go to Discord and talk about it, do Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot have agency? But I think that we can take that there if anybody wants to go to the Discord and talk about it. But before we do, I want to say thank you all for joining us here today. You've been a great panel. You really have. And everybody in the chat and the folks who've done questions, I really appreciate it. And finally, I want to give a big shout out to our tech folks who have been so good in handling us here on this panel and others. Betsy, Sid, thank you all. And see you all at Discord and at hopefully at Balticon in 2022 live. So
Is that
take
the
care.